everybody, and welcome to Alan History Nerd. This video is going to look at Tsarist Russia, in particular social developments up until 1914. So we're looking at social developments in the reign of Nicholas II, with a bit of kind of leftover stuff of trends and things that are moving from the time of his father and his grandfather. This is part of my playlist looking at Tsarist and Communist Russia from 1855 through to 1964. This is to help students studying this particular topic in A-level history. So if you haven't seen the other videos, then make sure you go and check out that playlist. So what we need to look at in this particular video is social developments to 1914, and the specification says that we should look at changing conditions of working and living in towns and countryside, social divisions and cultural changes. So we're going to do all of that and make sure that we've got a decent understanding of exactly what is going on in Tsarist Russia at this time, and how society is developing and moving forwards or not. Firstly, conditions in the towns. Well, the urban population had increased by about 21 million in between 1867 and 1917. So we're talking about a massive amount of growth. There's also a threefold increase in the number of people working in factories. With such a dramatic growth over such a period of time, there's bound to have a fairly significant impact. And there simply wasn't the accommodation within these towns and cities to put up with this influx of people. And so people lived in barrack-like accommodations rather than what we would recognise as kind of homes. They ate in communal canteens, they washed in communal baths. So working in a factory was almost a bit more like being in the army than anything else. And the first waves of people moving to the towns and cities were generally men going off to try and earn some money to send back to their family back in the village, and hoping to return back to the village themselves ultimately. There was private accommodation. I use private in the looser sense of the term because you tended to have multiple families crammed into the same house. Conditions, and these were very poor. Less than half of houses had the basics of running water or sewage. 30,000 people died of cholera in St. Petersburg in 1908-1909. And about 75% in St. Petersburg and Moscow were actually peasant born. Now these people tended to bring the countryside with them. They'd have livestock living with them. There were frequent peasant markets, including in the major squares in the big cities. So for a lot of the people, they initially started to see these things as being temporary. There wasn't the established towns and cities with the accommodation and stuff for people to move into. This is still actually a relatively small fraction of the Russian population as a whole as well. So urbanisation is happening, and it's not great, but it is at least a change. Working conditions in the towns were, well, they weren't great. The conditions were often very poor in a lot of the factories and other workplaces. Workers, generally speaking, were very poorly paid, though obviously this varied depending on the level of skill and occupation that you had, and where you were as well, because Russia is a big and varied place. The number of women in the workforce increased considerably, 1 in 5 in 1885, 1 in 3 in 1914. Though they did on average 50% less than men. There was an economic depression from 1900 to 1908, and even after this, wages didn't keep up with inflation, which is probably not surprising because inflation was running at about 40%. So again, we're seeing industrialization, we're seeing lots of factory work, but we aren't necessarily seeing the workers themselves getting any benefit from this particularly. There was some attempts by the Tsarist regime to help the workers. In 1885, there was rules brought in on no nighttime employment for women and children. In 1886, the enforcement of contracts was overseen by factory boards to try and check there wasn't too much unscrupulous action by factory owners. In 1892, no women and children were allowed in the mines anymore. The children over the age of 12 still were, but children under the age of 12 weren't. In 1897, there was a working hours limitation to 11.5 hours a day, which kind of puts modern working practices into some kind of perspective. After 1903, there were more effective factory inspections, and quite a major one in 1912, sickness and accident insurance for workers. And that one in particular is not enormously out in terms of timing from what was happening in other countries, such as the UK. Now, generally speaking, these bits of legislation didn't go far enough and didn't do enough to ensure safe and healthy working conditions and decent hours and pay for the workers. And so we see lots of industrial action. So, for example, there were over 3,500 strikes in 1914, and from 1905 onwards, there'd been lots of political activists trying to stir up the workers and getting involved in the trade unions and the workers' movements. Most workers, however, weren't particularly interested in changing the political system. Most of them just wanted better paying conditions. And it really is a major failing of the Tsarist regime that it fails to deliver that, because if it had delivered that, then we might well have not seen the revolutions that we see in 1917. Probably the most famous example of things going horribly wrong in terms of the workers in this period of time are the lena gofield massacre. And this is a particularly famous example of worker unrest. Now, the starting of it is just hideous. I mean, the miners went on strike, having been given gone-off horse meat as their food. There were Bolshevik agitators that were involved in turning this into wider unrest. The ringleaders who'd gone on strike over being fed this rotten horse meat were arrested. And the miners decided to present a petition to the mine owners. So they headed to the mine in large numbers. There was over 1,000 of them. As they approached the mine, there was a panic, and people guarding the mine opened fire on them, and 500 miners were killed. Hence, this being called a massacre, because it was. Now, the conditions in this gold mine had been horrendous, and the being fed rotten horse meat was just the final straw. But the fact that the workers just leading a petition could be shot on again showed a complete lack of progress in the Tsarist regime. Remember the events of Bloody Sunday going back to 1905, when a petition had been taken to the Winter Palace and resulted in protesters getting shot. So again, the regime is not doing itself any favours. And this led to a huge level of sympathetic strikes across Siberia and then across Russia as a whole. And over the next 2 years, 3 million workers were involved in strikes, and the groups like the Bolsheviks' influence started to grow. Conditions of working and living in the countryside. Well, despite the efforts of Stolypin and others, things remained largely unchanged in a huge percentage of the countryside. Strip farming was still used on about 90% of the land, and this was a method that had been stopped being used in most Western countries a couple of hundred years before. It's really inefficient, and it prevents the use of modern techniques. It prevents improvisation and change. The one exception in the countryside where things were improving were this group, the kulaks. They were making use of loans from peasant banks and buying up land. They would then be able to use more modern agricultural techniques. Sometimes they took advantage of the misfortune of some of their neighbours and helped become better off, and sometimes they ended up employing some of their former neighbours. There was also the migration to some of the fertile lands in southern western Siberia. But we have to remember this is about 3.5 million out of a population of 97 million, so it is not a gigantic number of people. Some areas were better off than others. So, for example, the farmland in the Baltic and western Ukraine and the northern Caucasus was really good, and people prospered there a bit more. Whilst in central Russia, it remained really backwards. The quality of the land and the technology and the methods used meant that people tended to remain very, very poor. Diet was very poor in the countryside, as was the level of medical care, which was really poor. So mortality rates were really high. Well over half the population was illiterate. So many people lived a very basic way of life. There was subsistence farming, and they've been subsistence farming for hundreds of years, and that's essentially what they continued to do. They lived in very basic wooden huts. They had no luxuries apart from maybe a few icons or things like that. So life was pretty tough in the countryside. We're going to look at the different groups in society and how they were impacted on during this period. We'll start with the nobility, who had really quite a mixed bag, or a mixed story at this period of time. I mean, some continued to thrive. They kept their old positions in the military, in government, in the civil service, and they tended to dominate those areas. They also had done really well out of the land distribution, largely because they controlled it. Some of them did really good. It did really well in terms of investing wealth in industry and speculating on financial markets and making loads of money. About a third of nobles, however, lost noble land was lost to peasants and others lower in the social strata. Some nobles failed to adjust their lifestyle accordingly when they'd lost large swathes of their land, and so they were less well off, but they still lived like they were still fabulously well off, and got into loads and loads of debt. Some didn't do a good job of investing in industry and speculating in financial markets. They didn't really understand it, and therefore lost a load of money. Overall, the nobility remained on top. Taxes remained focused on the peasantry. Landed wealth remained largely intact, and a solid kind of basis for wealth. The nobility continued to dominate the high offices, such as provisional governorships. The power in the Zemstvo. They also, each area had its provisional noble assemblies that met every year, that had quite an important role within the regions. So the Russian nobility remained at the top of Russian society. Probably the most exciting development in this period of time was the growth of the middle classes. This is a strata that was fairly new, really, and it was growing rather rapidly as a new industrial society emerged. There was a growing demand for skilled professionals and positions such as managers and statisticians and civil engineers and teachers and pharmacists and doctors, to name a few. Loads and loads of other ones as well. So this class included those who'd worked themselves up from peasant backgrounds through essentially hard work, entrepreneurial skill, gaining some access to education and making use of it. And it also included some who came from more noble backgrounds, particularly younger sons from noble families who had chosen to, or had been forced to, essentially enter the world of business and industry to try and make a living. In about 1914, there were about 28,000 doctors and about 20,000 teachers. So these numbers are growing, but they're still pretty small. The class organised itself. This was one of the exciting things about the growth of the middle class. So they organised, they created professional associations and scientific societies, various kind of voluntary sector groups, and to try and do some good in Russia, and also to promote their own interests. They also played an important role on councils of the state and town dumas. They played an important role in a lot of the Zemstvo. So they were still quite a small group in Russia, but they were becoming an increasingly powerful one. And they are one of the groups that's going to be intellectually leading demands for reform, and particularly demands for greater democracy. And this is a group really that the Tsarist regime should have been plugging into and promoting and getting support from, and they didn't always manage to do that. Workers and the peasants. Well, obviously these are the guys at the bottom of the social strata, and the peasants in particular faced a great deal of upheaval, or some within the peasantry did, and a lot of the ties in society that had held kind of Russian society together in the past had started to break down. So the village had been central for the peasantry for hundreds of years, and there was a great deal of legal and economic ties that held people to the village. Well, they started to weaken. So obviously there'd been emancipation back under Alexander II, but things like redemption payments came to an end in the reign of Nicholas II. There was more industry and other areas of work for people to go into. So quite large numbers of people started to leave. So although people actually left the village, in a lot of ways the village didn't leave the people. And I've already mentioned this already, is that even when moving to towns and cities, people were slow to take on these new surroundings, to grow new identities, which obviously takes a lot longer than simply moving house for a period of time. This did tend to happen though. So the working classes in the towns and the cities started to get more of a kind of a consciousness of itself. They very much were the target of the political groups who wanted to radicalise them and push ideas of revolution. And there was a degree of success in this because, of course, these workers found themselves living and working in very poor conditions, and meant that they were willing to listen to people who were telling them about a possibility of a better future. It must be noted, however, that actually most peasants actually stayed in their villages and saw very little change in their way of life or their standard of living. So there are some going through enormous upheaval and change, and there are some who really not very much at all is any different than it had been 50 years before. Now, cultural changes were also spreading through Russia. Now, Russia very, very much a patriarchy, so it's based on the idea of male dominance. And Nicholas II, like his father and his grandfather behind him, had tried to limit female education, for example. But those opportunities nevertheless grew. And 45% of university students in 1914, for example, in Russia, were female. And levels of independence through waged factory work also increased for women lower down the social strata. And evidence of this kind of growing idea of women's right and women's role in society is shown by the first All-Russian Congress of Women that met in 1908 with over 1,000 attendees, and that started to campaign for female votes. Primary education was another area of major growth. I mean, the government in 1896 was spending 5 million rubles on primary education. In 1914, it was spending 82 million. 44% of 8 to 11-year-olds were receiving primary education in 1911. 2/3 of that group were male and 1/3 female. The numbers, that's an overall average, 44%, but the numbers were higher in towns and cities. They were lower in the countryside. There was secondary and higher education, but these remained very much for the elite. Though the university places reached 69,000 in 1914, it had been 5,000 in 1860. But again, these numbers are small. We're talking a population 100 million, so we're talking a very much elite group. Though the improvement in education, even at primary level, led to a boom in popular press and literature as more and more people could read. There was some fairly significant stuff going on in terms of art and literature. So we've got key authors like Chekhov, who wrote about the problems in Russian society. For example, the cherry orchard and the seagull. There's a picture of him sat in that lovely looking green chair at the top. That's Chekhov. And also people got access to some of the classics, such as that had been written a little bit earlier. So the works of Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, amongst other things, and Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, amongst other things. So these were mass produced, and more people could read them, and they were cheap to buy. And so we see growth of reading rooms and things like that. So we have got a bit of a cultural explosion going on. And this is helped by the relaxation of censorship, and we see what is known as the Silver Age of Russian culture, and we see aspects of modernism in this. So we've got lots of poetry. We've got the music of Stravinsky, who's seen as one of the most significant composers and musicians of this period of time. We see, again, see the image of him there in black and white. We've got the ballets of Diaghilev, and also the paintings of Malevich, and there's one of those just above me. I can't claim to really understand, well, not, but that is something that was going on in Russia. So it's always worth having a bit more of a further delve into some of these people and what they were writing about, and what they were, and the music and the art and all the rest of it, to try and get a real sense of what was going on in Russia at this point of time. So it can be easy to get pulled into kind of the rather grim pictures of the peasantry and sort of revolution and all that kind of stuff. But there was cultural growth and ideas of modern culture in this period in Russia, and some of the writers, for example, that are on this bit of the video are not only held as great writers in Russia, but his works have been translated into many languages and much celebrated across the world. Finally, we're going to look at the centenary of 1913. So this is the 300th anniversary of Romanov power. So going back to 1613, when Mikhail I became the first Romanov ruler. There was a huge nationwide celebration. It all started in St. Petersburg with huge crowds, dignitaries from all over the empire, all the leaders of key leaders of the Orthodox Church. Factories were shut for the day. Free meals were given out. 2,000 prisoners were given amnesty and released. There was some problems because there was a rumour that pawnbrokers were going to give all the stuff back and not charge any interest, which proved not to be true. So some people attacked the pawn shops. But generally, it was a great day of big celebration, pomp and ceremony, and no expense was spared, and big crowds in the street, very lavish parties for the dignitaries. And the Tsar then went on a tour of his empire, following the route of the first Romanov ruler, Mikhail I, who had been, and this is worth noting, elected in 1613, and ending up in Moscow again, where there was even another big fuss made. It was all a huge propaganda coup, and this gave the impression to the Russian people and to the watching world and the Tsar and the Tsarina that they were much loved. I mean, one of the most infamous things was Tsarina Alexandra infamously said, "We need merely to show ourselves, and at once their hearts are ours." And yes, there was lots of celebration, but again, essentially, if you told people they get to celebrate 300 years worth of history, they get a day off work, they get free food, and there's big firework displays and light shows and lots of really unusual and cool stuff going on, then they'll generally get quite excited. It doesn't necessarily mean they had great affection for Nicholas II, though we must remember that there was a kind of remaining loyalty amongst a lot of people in Russia to the Tsar and the Tsarist regime. And they got very spectacular things made, like with a funny egg thing with lots of images of the Romanov Tsars on it. This was the era of Fabergé. So we do see some fairly major cultural events at this period of time in Tsarist Russia. Well, I hope that's been useful for you and given you some ideas on society and societal change in this period, and the different groups involved and what living and working conditions were like for people at this point in time. If you have enjoyed it, then please hit the like button, share it with anybody else you know who's studying this period and this might be helpful for them. If you haven't done so already, then please subscribe to the channel. I am going to be adding lots more videos, not only on this topic in history, but on others, as well as stuff on A-level politics as well. So if you're doing any of that, then it'd be well worth subscribing, get notifications as more stuff is entered. So for example, on this and other parts of the specification, I intend to cover the whole lot eventually, and therefore you will have a whole series of videos going through the whole course, particularly useful, especially if you're not getting into school as much as you otherwise would be. Right, thank you very much for watching.